Welcome for some more affordable fixed blade content. If you've been following the channel, you know we've been taking a look at a lot of Scandi ground knives, most recently knives made in Ukraine from BPS and BeaverCraft. And speaking of BeaverCraft, I was impressed enough by their BSH1 and 2, the knives that they have named the Dune and the Glacier, that I went ahead and bought a couple of more. I mean, they're affordable, and I feel like you're getting a lot of value for the money. From the title, you know that we're going to take a look at the BSH5 today, which they have named Shadow. Now, I feel like BeaverCraft is doing themselves a marketing service by giving their knives catchy names. I mean, Shadow certainly caught my attention. But while they describe this knife as being a camp small bushcraft knife, especially if I'm comparing it to the 1 and the 2, there are certain places the design just didn't quite measure up for me. I mean, it's not a bad knife, especially for the money, but my disappointments start with the sheath. Now, like the sheath on the 1 and the 2, it's made out of that supple leather, which has its pros and cons. Stamped with the BeaverCraft logo, but okay, let me recap what I liked about the sheath on the 1 and the 2. First of all, it's a standard drop-in design. It's well fit for the knife. Retention is created by having about half the grip down in here, leaving me plenty of real estate for a positive grip and deployment. Also, I am getting the options of a belt loop and a dangler, and the dangler is removable. But on the 5, all I'm getting is a belt loop, and I'm going to say it's a pretty flimsy one. And then instead of a drop-in, I'm getting this, well, I hesitate to call it a retention strap. I'll explain why in a second. When I first got it, yeah, it was really, really tight. It took a lot of break-in. It was really hard to break and even harder to re-secure. And when I finally got it broken in, I accidentally realized that it's because of the grip shape serving, well, fundamentally no purpose whatsoever. This knife would have been much better served by having a sheath like this. Also because, well, there's not much grip exposed, even with the thumb brake popped. I don't have much to grab onto. However, I have been making a reasonable use of the lower grip screw, and we'll talk about that in just a second, to be able to kind of pinch grip the end of it for deployment. Brings it out for me in a screwdriver grip. We'll talk about that later in handling, but yeah, I really would have appreciated this coming in a sheath like this. Okay, things get better when I talk about the friendly end, because there's a lot of things I do like about it. Well, like other BPS and BeaverCraft knives, you are getting walnut scales over a full tang secured with 2 screws. Now, with the 1 and the 2, those screw heads were recessed down into the grip. Here, like some of the BPS samples we looked at, the grip screws stick out, which aren't really hot spots. They do create some interesting indexing points. And as I mentioned, talking about the sheath, since I don't have much sticking out, having something a little extra to grab onto here to deploy the thing really helps. But one thing I feel like this knife is missing, especially because it has such a small grip and so little is sticking out of the sheath, I really would have liked a lanyard hole there. But I can see where there's not a whole lot of room for it. I might try to add one of my own later. But otherwise, I like the shaping of the grip. It's very ergonomic, it's very hand-filling, it's a rounded front to back, flat on the sides. I didn't have to do much reshaping for my own tastes at all. Sometimes I just kind of sand corners down a little bit. Didn't really have to do any of that here. Now, it does have kind of an index finger groove here, straight transition onto the spine. We'll talk about that in performance, but there's not much in the way of a guard here, and that does become problematic with one potential application, but that's somewhat mitigated by having this nice round button. We'll also talk about that in, well, Marshall handling. But, okay, this grip, even though it is kind of girthy and hand-filling, might be a little short for you. Functional dimension here, we're talking point to about right there, is 3 3/4 inches, about 9.5 centimeters. So my medium-sized hands, yeah, pretty much swallow the whole thing. If your hands are bigger than mine, it might feel a little small. Some other points of disappointment come up in discussing the blade, but before I get to that, how much did I pay for the thing? When I got it a month or so ago, as of this filming, it was going for around $36 US on Amazon, and for that I'm getting a 1066 high carbon steel blade that my test files are saying probably somewhere around 57 HRC, which is as advertised. This one though comes with, okay, they don't call it a DLC coating, they just call it blackening, but in performance it has been performing like a DLC coating. I put this through a lot of tough use, including chopping and batoning, and yeah, not a mark on it. Plus it is really good at resisting corrosion. So the coating is absolutely doing its job. That's a positive. But I did have the same kind of problem I ran into with a couple of Mora knives where they put the coating on, well, after they'd sharpened the knife. So the coating kind of covered the edge, and that didn't interfere with certain tasks. It made the knife not shaving sharp, but as you're going to see from the performance footage, when I first took it out to do wood carving, it was pretty frustrating. So I wound up reprofiling this edge, and okay, speaking of that, this is something that was unexpected but not unadvertised. As I'm reading the description for the knife, it says it's hollow ground. And I'm thinking, well, that's got to be a typo because other knives are Scandi ground, and it looks from the picture to be Scandi ground. I mean, that's not a high grind at all. But no, it's actually hollow ground, and because it is such a shallow hollow grind, there's not a lot of hollow grind to work with. And if you watch some of my early videos where I talked about how I really don't like hollow ground knives, you really have to make a hollow ground knife impress me. This one really didn't. So I've needed to improve this edge, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. So yeah, the edge kind of let me down. Blade shape and geometry, we'll talk about it, how it performs in different ways, but it's basically a swept forward, kind of a rounded, call it a Warncliffe profile. As I mentioned, you've got a straight transition here onto the spine. There's no jimping or anything. But yeah, the spine is certainly coarse enough to strike a ferro rod. And yeah, striking a ferro rod has not marred that finish, whatever that finish is. Really durable finish. But your functional dimensions, all right, let's talk about that. Blade length, bit on the short end, you're talking about 3 3/4 inches, 9.5 centimeters. So the blade is the same length as the grip, functionally speaking. Overall weight is 4.5 ounces. Yes, I'm looking down at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial, 125 grams. Now, your blade width front to back at the widest point is 1 1/8 inches, 3 centimeters. Stock thickness, like a lot of the other knives I've seen from BeaverCraft and also BPS, 2.8 millimeters. Let's go ahead and get straight to that test footage, and then we will talk about how it's performed for me.
Fine carving with the shadow. I'm going to say very comfortable in the hand. I've got a lot of leverage over it, but it just doesn't bite as well as my true Scandi ground knives. Needs a little bit of work, I think, to improve that edge geometry. Let's try it out on some heavier carving. Again, it's just not biting as well as some of my other Scandi ground Ukrainian knives. So I think I may do something about that edge. It's not useless, but the other ones definitely outclass it in terms of how they bite into wood. Problem there. Pretty clean. Been doing a lot of that, and so far there's been no damage to the finish. Wow, still no damage to the finish.
So this is not only the post-test, but also the post-improvement edge. I mean, it was doing fine for utility tasks and food prep and things like that, but really disappointed with its performance in carving tasks. So I went ahead and, well, removed a good 2 millimeters of that coating, took that secondary edge bevel back, took it back out. It did perform better without any refreshment. Let's see where it's at right now. Not bad. Cardboard. Yeah, really smooth through that. So, better. Summary test results, yeah, kind of frustrating and disappointing. Starting with the most martial test, which is thrusting and stabbing first into my Pell, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target to check penetration and channel into softer media, and then to test tip durability into harder media straight into the redwood. And I'm going to say the tip just really isn't designed to do that well. Now, it's not so much about it being a swept forward Warncliffe style point, because sacks would be very effective at that task. But the angle of the tip and the curvatures and things, just it's not maximized to do that job. Now, the tip is certainly durable, didn't take any damage into the harder media, but it just wasn't penetrating into the soft media, hitting a lot more in my spectrum of tip geometries like a shovel than a needle, I suppose better than a pointed stick. But I could get somewhat better effectiveness out of it if I altered my angle of attack, but that was very dependent on grip. But speaking of, the other big thing I'm looking for in those tests is how linear impact is translated back into my hand. Any uncomfortable collisions? No, very comfortable grip. But does my hand stay put? Absolutely not, without making certain adjustments. In the forward grip, if I am hammer gripping or hand shaking, yeah, under impact my hand is going right up into danger in either blade orientation, edge facing away from me or towards me. So I had to use a screwdriver grip. And thankfully, a short, stout grip with a rounded butt is probably the most comfortable grip for me to do that in. But as for tip angle, okay, with the edge facing away from me, if I was to thrust with the blade more in a straight line with my arm, I did get maximum use out of that tip. hit more of an arc, I was hitting more of the flat here. And that also came up well in the opposite way when I rotated the blade towards me. If I tried to get a straight line thrust, yeah, I was colliding much more with that than that. But if I arced it around a corner, that's when the functionality of the tip came back for me. But again, not great at that job. Similar result in the reverse grip. But again, I had to thumb lock it to keep my hand from sliding up into danger. With the edge facing away from me, had very mixed results. Again, I was hitting a lot more here than tip. With the edge facing towards me, yeah, now the angle of the tip was working better for me, but I did have to remember to get my thumb up on the back. And under adrenaline, shifting to screwdriver and the thumb lock might be something I forget to do. We'll talk about that more in martial handling. But things that the knife should be better at. I talked about my frustration with the edge, and when I tried fine carving with it, grip, security, leverage, great, very comfortable in hand, but I felt like that edge just wasn't biting into the wood, and that continued when I tried to bite deeper into the wood to do things like carve stakes or feather sticks out of a branch. Yeah, it just wasn't biting compared to a lot of the other knives I've tested. Certainly my Scandi ground knives did a lot better. Maybe I've just gotten really used to the Scandi ground. But this one did really disappoint me. Now I did go ahead and improve that edge, take that secondary bevel back to about 1.5 millimeters, took it back out, and it did better, but still not great. And that also showed up in the batoning. Now this is a short blade, but it is a very durable steel. I've certainly pounded the heck out of this 1066, not worried about it failing, but because it's a short blade, it's not going to be able to get through anything thick. Now, cross batoning through a branch, it did meet some resistance, but it did the job. Going through a log, again, I couldn't do a very thick log. Okay, I did pick a log with a lot of knots in it. That hollow ground edge does meet some resistance in the transition, but once it was down into the log, it did a fine job. And I do have to say, well, I did repeat the batoning test because I realized I had a really bad camera angle on the first run. But through the batoning and the chopping and all the other use, including striking a fire steel, yeah, there's not a mark on that finish. So the finish is awesome. The edge, not so much. Before we get to whatever martial potential it might have, this is where we usually talk about that balance between utility and martial usefulness that could make for an ideal all-around carry knife. Also help you out with optics if you are somewhere where people might be sensitive to you carrying a dedicated weapon. Some of those people might be law enforcement, and yes, there is a powerful bias, even in my country, to anyone using an edged weapon for even the most justifiable self-defense. So carrying a knife that looks like a tool that you can justify carrying as a tool might help you out. And yes, this definitely looks a lot more like a tool than a weapon. We'll talk about how it functions as such in a second. But yeah, I'm going to say as a utility tool, it did kind of disappoint me, and it might wind up getting relegated to being either a toolbox knife, or I might try to make some modifications to it. You might see a follow-up video. One of the things that I was thinking when I bought a lot of these inexpensive knives is the potential for modification projects. But the other thing I've got to mention when it comes to utility carry, I'm no fan of the sheath system. It doesn't carry well, it doesn't deploy well for me. But we've already kind of talked about, is this at all designed to be a martial knife? I'm going to say no, absolutely not. But it is a nearly 4-inch long fixed blade. If it was all you had in that moment, I hope never happens to you, what is its potential? Martially speaking, there are a lot of frustrating ups and downs about the blade and the grip design. We've already talked about the tip angle and the slippiness of the grip, but given the profile of the blade, kind of looks like a utility knife, and the forward grip edge facing away from me, could I make any good use out of slashing with it? Well, potentially to wound or to intimidate. But if my opponent's not easily intimidated or is wearing thick clothing, yeah, reality has taught us with a knife of this length, your tip is going to be your primary tool. Your use of the edge, practically speaking, is going to be pretty limited because it's not one of these that functions kind of like a short sword. And we've talked about, well, the drawbacks of that tip angle, but there are ways I could make it work better than, shall we say, a pointed stick. Edge facing away from me, keeping the tip more in line with my arm gets best use out of it. Edge facing towards me, well, I'm going to go around corners. But I have to compensate for the slippy grip, which means screwdriver grip. Now the upside of that is that short grip, the grip shape, the rounded butt, makes screwdriver gripping this knife ideal. Edge facing away from me, yeah, that's actually really comfortable. Edge facing towards me, not as much, but it's not bad. But the fact is I have to remember to do that. Under adrenaline, I might default to what's more natural, what I use more commonly, which is going to be a hammer grip or handshake grip. And if I hit something linearly with this knife, my hand's probably not going to stay out of danger. So that's something to consider. What about reverse grip, though? When we have to get to transitions, and I'm going to say, actually, this is where the grip shape helps me out a lot, at least in one way. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you know that I do not recommend you transition your knife when you're in reach of your opponent, and you always consider what adrenaline is going to do to destroy your fine motor coordination. Should you be trying to transition the knife at all, which is why I train with my knife in all sorts of different grips so I can use it however it's in my hand. If you're going to do it in a real situation at all, I'm going to recommend you do it in two hands, but if you want to explore in your training one-handed transition, well, I could use my bad habit of finger twirling, even though the knife is kind of short and chunky for that, but I don't recommend that because it's easy to fumble. The reason I like using it, not only have I used it a long time, but it keeps the edge facing the same way, versus pinch flipping, which reverses my edge. Now, I've mentioned this in other videos that if the grip is really biased, I can control which way the edge is facing simply by clamping my fingers down on it, but this grip isn't biased enough that I feel confident keeping, well, my edge orientation. So I've got to consider whatever edge orientation the knife ends up in is how I'm going to have to use it. However, short grip, rounded butt, that screw at the bottom for an indexing point, yeah, pinch flipping this knife is really smooth and comfortable. So yeah, that's a nice technique. But okay, you got to talk about the tip angle and the grip. Edge facing away from me, I've got to watch the angle of attack to keep from hitting more on the back of the tip. Might I have any slashing action on the front of it? Well, we kind of talked about the paradox in previous videos of the leverage and tip control I'm getting with a shorter knife as compared to how awkward one of these can be in reverse grip. So yeah, I feel like that could be a potential tool on the table, but not nearly, again, as effective as the tip. And if I'm going to use the tip in either blade orientation, I'm going to have to thumb lock the butt or my hand's going into danger. Edge facing towards me, I feel like I'm getting a much better tip angle for penetration, also some back cutting angle in that arc or reverse slashing, but yeah, I've got to remember, and I don't always remember, to thumb lock the butt of the knife. Alright, speaking of the butt of the knife, full tang, could it be used as a less lethal impact tool? Yes and no. Again, I have medium width hands. If I'm gripping it conventionally, there's really nothing sticking out past the soft, fleshy bits of my fist. But if, again, I remember to thumb lock the top of the grip scale, now I got something, potentially. So, limited usefulness? All right. Let's stop the video here and get our conversation going. If you have any questions, thoughts about this knife, other Ukrainian-made blades, Scandi ground knives, affordable utility knives, keep those recommendations coming. preview for the next video, we'll be talking about the BeaverCraft BSH5 that they have named Nightfall. And spoiler alert, I'm going to say I like this knife a whole lot better in a lot of different ways than, well, what this one did for me. But until then, as always, thank you all so much for watching, liking, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for Nightfall?